What's up, guys? Levi here. So, as part of this channel, I wanted to do things in terms of film and TV. So, do things like movie reviews, TV show reviews, top tens, and whatnot. And I thought a good place to start would be to review the final season of The Boys, but mainly talk about the last episode. So, I was a bit late to the party when it came to watching The Boys. I think I started watching just after season 3 had aired. But watching those first 3 seasons, I really enjoyed them. I thought that the acting was great, I thought the story was great, the set pieces were great. And after seeing season 3, I was quite looking forward to seeing what was going to happen next. So, in terms of season 5, what I liked the most was I think that the first 2 or 3 episodes were good ones. But then after that, you could definitely tell that the quality had just declined further and further. And then in the penultimate episode, that's when my interest just went completely off a cliff, which I'll get into in a little bit. Another thing that I liked was that the actors, whether the writing was good, whether it was bad, you could tell they were putting their role into it. So Homelander, Anthony Starr, he carried the series along with Carl Urban, who played Butcher. Personal favourite of mine was Jensen Ackles as Soldier Boy. Now, I know a lot of people love Jensen Ackles because of Supernatural. I actually didn't watch Supernatural until after I'd watched The Boy, so I'm kind of unbiased when it comes to Soldier Boy. And some of the character endings I did like. I like that A-Train had his redemption arc, and even though he didn't make it, I feel like his ending was a satisfying one. I liked Huey's ending with Starlight, them having, well, with Starlight being pregnant and still fighting crime as more of like a vigilante. Homelander's ending I'll talk a little bit more about later on, but I think that his ending overall, it definitely fit the character when you think of his insecurities and his like need to be loved throughout pretty much the whole series. Mother's Milk ending I liked as well because he was in the first few episodes of season 5, you could tell that he wasn't right at all. He felt like he couldn't go back to his family, and to see him have that ending where it looked like he'd gotten married or renewed his vows, I felt like it was quite satisfying, especially when he's taken Ryan on as not like a son, but he's just taken Ryan in because that would have been what Butcher would have wanted. And the Deep as well. I know that the fandom was quite divided on the Deep. Some people thought that he should have made it to the very end. Some people thought he should have lived. Some people thought he should have died. I think the way he went out, I quite liked it. I quite like the fact that you have this character who has been just weaseling his way throughout each season and making it to the next one. And to conclude his storyline the way they did, I think it was well thought out. So that's the positives out of the way. Here's the things I didn't like. So after episode 2 or 3, that's when things really start to go downhill for the series. They were just fleshing out too much that didn't actually need to be fleshed out. They were wasting time with things like the 2 soups that were crawling on the floor sniffing each other's asses in the penultimate episode just for shock value. And you had so much time wasted on this virus and V1, which ultimately in the end didn't amount to anything. They ended up spending an hour and 5 or whatever it was in the season finale just cramming everything possible into it just so that they could tie up any loose ends, finish the story, which overall I think it made the whole viewing experience worse. But why, after spending so much time focusing on the virus was part of the story from season 4, and it seemed like the real end game for the series, only for then it to just be meaningless. What, like 2 episodes left into season 5? You had the whole V1 brought into it, which essentially it was just marketing for the spin-off Fort Rising. There's no other way to put it, really, which again is another negative. I think that Soldier Boy being brought back, even though he had become quite the fan favorite, basically to promote Fort Rising and then get put back on ice for the third time in the series, I just felt like there could have been so much better done with that character. But then you have V1. V1 was the ultimate antidote to the virus. Obviously, Soldier Boy was exposed to this virus, but he lived because he had V1 in his system. But even after spending some time on V1 and then Homelander ultimately getting it, there was no real payoff from it. Like, Homelander gets V1 and he doesn't do anything. He crushed the president's head and flew the Elon Musk type character into outer space. It felt like they were doing these things without thinking about how to pay these off properly. Like, we spent so much time with this virus, we spent so much time with V1, and ultimately it amounted to nothing. Which, upon further rewatches of this series, it's gonna drag season 4 down because we're spending so much time on this and it ultimately just amounts to nothing. But after spending so much time on those two things, why all of a sudden in the penultimate episode is Kimiko getting Soldier Boy's powers basically shoehorned in? You've got Homelander with V1. This should have been the point where the boys felt like this was a big loss for them. This should have been their Infinity War moment, and the last couple of episodes should have been their end game. But just to shoehorn in that Kimiko's getting Soldier Boy's powers because Butcher and Frenchie just so happened to be working on recreating the tests that were performed on Soldier Boy to give him these powers, it felt very cheap. It felt very much like they didn't want Soldier Boy in the finale at all. How are we going to do this? And ultimately, I just think that was something that didn't pay off. I had seen some leaks leading up to that episode that Kimiko was going to get those powers, and I was saying to myself, if this actually does happen, I think this might be where the series just completely takes a left turn for me, and ultimately it did. And then we got to the final episode, and it was just meh. My brother, when I told him I'd watched this, he asked me, what did you think to the ending out of 5? And I said to him, a 2. So, the thing with ending a TV series, if you hit the landing, great. But if you don't, it's always the same thing that gets brought up in the conversation, Game of Thrones. If I was to compare the ending of The Boys with another franchise, it wouldn't be Game of Thrones. Except for one thing, which I will mention a little later on. I found it more comparable with The Rise of Skywalker. Because the thing with The Rise of Skywalker was there were so many pacing issues with that film. It just felt like you were at this one point, then they did this, then it was on to the next point, and it just felt very much rushed, and they were trying to cram way too much into this. And ultimately, it just felt the same with The Boys. They spent too much time wasting what could have been a better story, just doing filler stuff. And you get to the finale, and it just felt like they crammed way too much into this. They could have easily benefited from the finale being like a 2 hour long episode. They could have easily benefited from cutting some of the stuff out from earlier episodes, and we could have got other things, much better things, which would have made the finale much more satisfying. But the main thing I walked away from the Boys season finale feeling quite let down about was the fact that we didn't get to see Homelander go on his rampage. It had been teased since very early in the series when you saw Homelander laser this crowd of people. From that point, myself, and I'm positive a lot of fans as well, wanted to see something like this. But it just never happened. And when you consider the fact that we had all this promotional material, so you had Homelander floating above Earth, and there was nukes going off and explosions, and nothing of the sort happened. When they released the poster for the finale, and you saw Butcher walking on the White House lawn with a crowbar in hand, and you had Homelander above the White House with a bunch of other supes flying around him, again, nothing of the sort happened. It just felt very unsatisfying that this had been teased for so long and it was just never paid off. You had like the slight tease towards the end of Homelander's speech where he turned, but before he could do anything about it, in comes Butcher and Kimiko. It just felt very much a letdown. Now, if I was to have done the final series, I would have had Homelander go berserk in maybe episode 5 or 6, and then you'd have those couple of episodes following on from that where Homelander's leveling cities, he's being absolutely brutal to anyone and everyone that's going to stand in his way. And from there you could have had the Soldier Boy turning on him because he's seen what Homelander's capable of and he doesn't like it. You could have had things like the military involvement. That would have been interesting to see how Homelander would deal with the military. You could have had this happen where Homelander basically levels an entire city to basically force people to follow his will. Because at the end of the day, Homelander, he was desperate for attention. He wanted to be loved, and in the end, the only way he was ever going to get that was by bringing it out of people through fear. But we got nothing of the sort. Butcher's turn at the end, I didn't like it. I know that in the comics, spoiler alert if you haven't read the comics, I know that in the comics that Butcher does turn on the boys and he's responsible for a lot of bad shit happening. But again, because this finale was just so full and crammed with a lot of things to tie up loose threads, it just felt like it was tacked on at the end just to create something shocking. Now, where I want to compare this with Game of Thrones is that in Game of Thrones you have this ultimate threat, the Night King, and then you have the Night King defeated, and then when Daenerys gets what she wants, she goes berserk and on a rampage after seeing Missandei die. And you can compare this with The Boys. So you have the ultimate threat in Homelander. You have the ultimate threat in Homelander defeated, and once Butcher has found out that Terra died, he then wanted to commit mass genocide on the Supes. In that sense, that is comparable with Game of Thrones. I'm not comparing this ending to Game of Thrones because the ending was bad. I took time to think about this. I didn't want to just completely compare the final episode of The Boys with Game of Thrones because both were bad endings. I genuinely wanted to think about this and just ask myself, why did this feel like a Game of Thrones sort of ending? And when you see the similarities, I feel like that kind of justifies the comparisons. you've got people saying that they did a Stranger Things because the Stranger Things finale was quite bad in a lot of people's eyes. I personally didn't mind it. I feel like they could have done a lot more with it, but I'll save that for another video. But in terms of the leaks, so I read a lot of the leaks. Well, the supposed leaks now. And with what they were putting into it, I felt like that would have been so much of a better ending. You had Homelander doing a press conference instead of a national address. You had him seeing like people's heartbeats that showed they weren't fully sold on it. So he then went on a rampage. He was lasering people in half and ripping, babies out of women's wombs. And then like an all-out battle between Homelander and the military. That would have been so much better. Now, obviously, some of the things that were being leaked is kind of taboo with like how far you can go on TV, but ultimately, it just goes to show that sometimes actual fans of this can be better than the people that are paid to write this stuff. But I don't know what happened with The Boys. I don't know if the budget was cut or if there was pressure from higher ups to, oh, we think that the fans want this, so we're going to do this, instead of listening to what the fans want, which is a major problem that's going on within media right now. But when a leaked plotline sounds so much better than what we actually got, there's a problem. So overall, I would give the entire season a 3 out of 5. 3 just because those first 2 or 3 episodes I really enjoyed. But the rest of it, you can't bring it up to a 4 or 5 after watching the rest of the series. In terms of the finale, I'm going to stick with my rating of 2 out of 5. I just feel like they could have done so much more with it. I feel like they could have left some things from previous episodes on the cutting room floor and just fleshed out what we saw in the finale across some episodes. I think that shelving Soldier Boy for the finale was a big mistake. But yeah, that's my overall thoughts on The Boys. One thing that I'm thinking of doing is a video on how I would have made the final season of The Boys. Obviously, it's a lot of writing because I've got 8 episodes worth of plot lines to think of. But this is one of the things that I wanted to do on this channel as well. I wanted to do a series on how I would have made certain films. So, for example, I've got in my files a sequel to the 1998 Godzilla, which wasn't well received, but I feel like I've done it in a way which would have brought people back. And just see how it goes. Maybe I do that bad a job of it, people might look at the finale and think, you know what? This wasn't actually so bad. But we'll see what happens. But yeah, that's my plans going ahead. I want to do top 10s, film reviews, TV reviews, how I would write, and just see where it goes. But yeah, as always, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.